River maps were supposed to be simple things, lines of blue following gravity, descending predictably from glaciers and snowfields into valleys that had been charted for centuries. I started with 19th century hydrographic surveys from Alpine cantons, tracing inked contours that once guided engineers, carving spillways and diversion channels through granite. What drew my attention were the margins, handwritten annotations beside printed elevations, small corrections in faded pencil, pressure readings that climbed where slopes should have relieved them. Maintenance ledgers deepened the unease. Crews reported seasonal surges that arrived without storms, subsurface echoes when pilings were driven, voids encountered beneath riverbeds and sealed without explanation. Switzerland, northern Italy, and western Austria, different authorities, identical phrasing. Each anomaly clustered near civic works and early rail corridors built during the same decades, as though transportation and water management had once shared a hidden blueprint. I began overlaying elevations with contemporary satellite models, checking gradients meter by meter. Several channels rose against gravity for short distances before descending again. Stone linings polished in a way sediment alone could not achieve. Water does not climb unless something assists it. Photographs surfaced next. Not postcards, not tourist albums, but municipal documentation. Grates embedded into riverbanks, vented stone housings half swallowed by moss. Ceramic conduits emerging from masonry and disappearing beneath later landscaping projects. They were catalogued as drainage upgrades, flood controls, routine reinforcements. Yet the construction dates conflicted across ministries by decades, sometimes by half a century. When separate departments record the same structure differently, coincidence becomes difficult to maintain. I stopped thinking of water as scenery and began treating it as infrastructure, layered and revised by hands that left no consistent signature behind. The Alps no longer looked carved solely by glaciers and rivers. They looked modified. Curiosity displaced certainty. The maps had opened a door, and everything beyond it was still submerged. Survey reports replaced maps on my desk, stacks of brittle paper listing coordinates where drill heads struck resistance far too soon. Shafts capped with masonry plugs, steel shutters fused shut by decades of mineral growth. Conduits rerouted beneath retaining walls poured long after the original stonework had vanished from municipal drawings. Renovation permits explained the changes as emergency flood responses, yet the dates refused to line up. Diversions were logged years before the storms that supposedly justified them. I went back into the field with gradient tools and ground-penetrating scans. The numbers refused to cooperate with the paperwork beneath shallow gravel beds. Stone ribs formed lattices so regular they resembled load-bearing frameworks rather than erosion barriers. Iron rings protruded from buried arches, oxidized into place, spaced as though something heavy had once been bolted into the current and later removed with care. Human figures surfaced only through accounting. Payroll rosters listed subterranean crews assigned to vault stabilization. Accident claims mentioned collapses inside chambers that had no schematics attached. Injuries incurred in spaces that officially did not exist. No photographs accompanied those filings, only terse annotations stamped confidential decades later, as if imagery itself had become unnecessary. The Alps began to feel less like terrain and more like casing. Curiosity thinned into suspicion. Individual rivers no longer mattered. What mattered was repetition. Identical engineering logic echoed from valley to valley, threaded beneath borders, ministries, and decades of revision. Something had once run through these mountains, and the effort to hide it was proving as systematic as whatever had baked it in the first place. The numbers refused to sit quietly. Stone arches buried beneath riverbeds carried curvature radii that exceeded what 19th century hydraulic works normally required. Their spans distributed weight laterally rather than downward, a geometry more consistent with pressure chambers. Then drainage tunnels. I began reconstructing stress profiles from surviving masonry, running the figures against period engineering manuals. The margins were too wide, the tolerances too generous. Museum drawers offered fragments that should not have survived immersion at all, labeled miscellaneous hydraulic debris. The alloy samples looked unremarkable until examined under spectroscopy. Early 20th century assay reports described composite mixtures resistant to corrosion yet flexible under load, combinations not formally catalogued in metallurgical literature of the era. One technician had scrawled a note in the margin of a 1924 analysis: composition unclear, source undocumented. Regional construction manuals complicated matters further. Ministries circulated standardized canal diagrams throughout Alpine districts, simple gravity-fed profiles copied from French and Prussian templates. None referenced reinforced arches beneath active river channels. None acknowledged submerged chambers requiring pressure regulation. When diagrams disagree with surviving structures, the structures demand attention. Builders disappeared behind mathematics. Whoever calculated these loads understood sustained hydraulic force at scales absent from conventional flood control. Operators replaced names, defined only by what the stone implied they had once maintained. Each recalculation tightened the frame of plausibility without breaking it, the figures suggesting intent rather than accident. Measurements stopped feeling incidental. They began to read like fingerprints. Every formula raised another quiet question, and every answer postponed the one that mattered most. Permit numbers became timelines with missing vertebrae. Entire years vanished between approvals, while blueprints duplicated signatures across provinces that supposedly never coordinated projects. Index cards pointed to drawings that no longer occupied their reference drawers. I followed those gaps through cantonal offices, into private hydroelectric archives, and then into federal repositories. Watching the same files reappear under new categories, power generation became flood mitigation, experimental works became routine drainage. Each reclassification narrowed what anyone later thought to ask. Marginal notes told a quieter story, dates overwritten in darker ink, stamps replaced by newer insignia pressed directly atop older seals. The layers suggested revision rather than decay. Librarians never entered the narrative directly. They existed only through correspondence logs requesting restricted access, inventory sheets marked incomplete, memos noting folios transferred and never logged back in. Documentation itself began to behave like architecture, reinforced, redirected, sealed. I stopped looking for missing machines and started tracking missing language. The further the trail ran, the colder it became, until absence carried more informational weight than any surviving page. Nothing accused, nothing confessed. The paperwork simply thinned wherever the engineering grew complex. Technical anomalies had opened the door. Bureaucracy was widening it. Across decades, across agencies, the same pattern held. Structures submerged, records simplified, systems and explanations retreating together, as if withdrawal had been scheduled rather than improvised. Journal indexes pushed the inquiry beyond drainage. Scattered technical publications from the early 20th century described Alpine hydro stations producing output curves that refused to match their catchment basins. The phrasing stayed careful. Innovative channeling, resonance effects, unusual intake geometry. None of the authors lingered on mechanisms. They simply reported efficiencies, then moved on. When I placed those articles beside the intake schematics already traced, beneath riverbeds the alignments tightened, shaft diameters matched, chamber spacing repeated. Great patterns echoed, the sealed apertures hidden behind newer embankments. Funding reports filled in another layer. Private consortia appeared briefly, raised capital, completed facilities, then dissolved within a decade. Their patents transferred quietly to municipal authorities, who never pursued further development, no upgrades, no replication programs, no export of technique. The paperwork ended where curiosity should have intensified. Inventors never surfaced, only corporate shells and initials buried in committee minutes. Engineers became departments. Departments became subcommittees. Responsibility diffused until it vanished. Energy had entered the picture, but explanation retreated in perfect proportion. The same pattern returned: construction followed by silence, and performance followed by archiving, installations left submerged rather than optimized, as though exploitation had become less desirable than containment. The Alps no longer felt like a network of rivers. They were beginning to resemble a grid. Returning to the rivers changed the texture of the inquiry. What sonar revealed beneath silt layers did not resemble abandoned culverts. Grates lay recessed into stone floors. Conduits crossed laterally under active channels before rising again downstream, their gradients inconsistent with flood diversion. Stone galleries widened into corridors large enough for maintenance crews, yet no municipal map acknowledged their existence. Cavities extended far beyond the declared lengths of drainage. Tunnels, forming chambers that followed geological seams too precisely to be accidental. I began aligning those voids with flood records. The chronology faltered. Several surges, described in regional newspapers, should have scoured riverbanks, yet damage assessments stayed minimal. No collapsed bridges, no washed embankments, only terse notes describing rapid stabilization and controlled discharge. Council minutes added another layer of compression. Emergency sessions approved backfilling projects within days, authorizing contractors to seal riverbed access points with minimal debate. Discussions ended abruptly in the transcripts, replaced by unanimous votes and adjournments. Mountains that once appeared inert began to read as housings. Nothing announced itself. No single structure demanded explanation. The weight accumulated, instead, each observation leaning against the next, until rivers felt less like terrain and more like disguises. Suspicion no longer needed emphasis. It was becoming structural. The trail did not end. It thinned. After the early 20th century, references to anomalous intakes began to dissolve into routine language. Maintenance budgets flattened into predictable columns. Inspection reports shortened from pages to paragraphs. Diagrams that once hinted at chambers and lateral conduits collapsed into simple spillways, gravity-fed channels rendered without depth or interior logic. I plotted the shift against broader changes in governance. Hydroelectric systems were nationalized. River authorities consolidated. Wartime secrecy policies encouraged classification by default rather than exception. Yet no directive ordered deletions. No memorandum instructed archivists to remove earlier material. The transformation happened through omission rather than command. A gradual narrowing of description that left nothing overtly missing until almost everything distinctive had vanished. Signatures replaced schematics, committees replaced engineers. Across borders, the same simplification unfolded. Alpine ministries adopted near-identical reporting templates. Once variable terminology hardened into standardized civil engineering phrases that left no room for anomalies. Extraordinary infrastructure did not disappear from the ground. It disappeared from language. Silence proved easier to institutionalize than destruction. What unsettled me was the absence of urgency. No crisis precipitated the change. No scandal preceded it. Systems were not condemned or dismantled. They were refiled. The machinery stayed submerged. The paperwork learned to forget it. Some of the structures never left. They were absorbed. Modern dams along Alpine rivers contain masonry segments older than the concrete poured around them. Stone arches locked into load-bearing positions, yet no longer connected to active hydraulic systems. Their curvature mirrors the submerged galleries traced upstream. The same rib spacing, the same reinforced joints, now treated as architectural curiosities rather than functional remnants. Tourist walkways pass over sealed vent shafts disguised with decorative iron grills. Interpretive plaques celebrate scenic overlooks and 20th century engineering milestones while ignoring apertures that drop straight into voids beneath the river channel. Restoration reports list them as legacy features retained for historical charm. No origin offered, no original function proposed. I began photographing those surfaces the way I had photographed riverbeds, Tool marks matched, mortar composition aligned. Decorative flourishes vanished where water would have once moved. Continuity replaced coincidence. The investigation narrowed again toward matter rather than paper. Stone resists reclassification. Signage committees appeared only through meeting summaries, selecting which elements deserved explanation and which would remain ornamental. Conservation agencies catalogued surfaces without acknowledging the spaces behind them. What unsettled me was proximity. People crossed these remnants every day. Cyclists leaned against parapets anchored to 19th century arches. Children traced patterns carved into lintels that once sealed the pressurized chambers. The systems had not been erased. They had been recontextualized. Archival silence had not produced absence. It had produced scenery. By that stage, coincidence was no longer a satisfying explanation. I began assembling the alternatives the way engineers do when confronted with anomalous systems. Perhaps these channels and chambers were experimental prototypes, abandoned after failure. Perhaps newer turbines rendered them obsolete. Perhaps flooding risk forced their closure. Economic inefficiency, regulatory pressure, wartime material shortages. Each theory produced a partial answer and then collapsed under scale. Abandonment does not require coordination across valleys separated by borders and languages. Obsolescence does not usually preserve structurally elaborate galleries, while simpler installations are demolished for scrap. Safety hazards are documented with urgency, not softened into routine maintenance budgets and decorative coverings. What persisted in the financial records were not decommissioning orders, but stabilization grants, reinforcement contracts, liability reviews, line items devoted to sealing access points rather than dismantling interior systems. Nowhere did the reports mention power output. Nowhere did they assess generation capacity. The language narrowed toward containment. I kept returning to that omission. If these were merely failed devices, why stabilize them at all? Why not remove them? Why entomb complexity? The question sharpened without yet forming an accusation. Controlled speculation replaced curiosity. The tone shifted toward restraint rather than revelation, the kind that settles in when multiple possibilities converge on why. The same uncomfortable center, something functional had once operated here. Something expensive had been deliberately preserved, not celebrated, not replicated, archived, stone by stone, ledger by ledger, hypothesis by hypothesis. The field narrowed, pointing less toward neglect than toward withdrawal, less toward accident than toward decision. And whatever had been sealed beneath those rivers, it had not been forgotten. It had been managed. When the fragments were finally placed together, they did not form a single site. They formed a geography, river maps overlaid with sealed shafts, intake tunnels that no longer connected to turbines, archival emissions repeating along political boundaries, stonework styles recurring hundreds of kilometers apart. Each element alone could be dismissed as provincial oddity. Together they traced corridors beneath the Alps, following watersheds rather than borders, aligning with 19th century rail routes and civic expansions in ways that suggested coordination without leaving behind a central blueprint. I resisted naming what could not yet be proven. The data did not permit declarations, only probability curves that bent in the same direction. Engineering anomalies clustered where paperwork thinned. Preservation budgets rose where schematics vanished. Decorative coverings appeared where machinery once demanded access. The pattern held. Institutions remained the only continuous presence. Ministries changed titles. Companies dissolved. Committees reformed under new statutes. The systems endured beneath them, quiet and structurally intact, while records grew progressively abstract. The emotional weight did not arrive as revelation. It accumulated through restraint, through the refusal of easy conclusions, through the realization that absence itself had become consistent across jurisdictions, and decades. Rivers continued to run above chambers that no agency publicly explained. Tourists crossed parapets anchored into older stone. Maintenance crews logged inspections without diagrams. Whatever those installations once accomplished, their disappearance from narrative had not required demolition. It had required patience, alignment, administrative gravity. The investigation ended where it began, not with certainty, but with flow lines bending toward something submerged, continuous, and deliberately left unspoken. The water kept moving. So did the questions.